2020 meeting of the Boulder Housing Advisory Board. Let's see who is present. Danny Teodoro. I think he's present.
Present. Hi.
There we go.
Yes.
And Juliette Boone.
Hello.
Jacques.
Hello, I'm here.
Let's see, Terry Pamos. Terry is not here yet, but I believe we have a quorum. Did I forget to call on anybody who is here? Okay. Quick review. Welcome everybody. Happy summer. Stay cool. Quick review of the agenda. I believe we have a quorum and we'll be able to approve our minutes, review and approve our minutes first, May 26th. Then we'll have some public participation and open comment. Matters from the board. We're going to have a couple of, I think will be very interesting presentations, one from our own Jay on affordable housing funding and finance, and then Ian Swallow has joined us from Boulder Housing Partners. Then we'll get into our retreat and a debrief and an attempt to prioritize work plan items based on the survey results. Didn't get a lot of survey results, but I got some very interesting comments on that. We'll go to item C, committee and project liaison reports. We do have those present. Maybe Terry will join us by then to report out on tiny homes and EPRAs. Matters from the staff. Number 7, debrief meeting and calendar check, and then we'll adjourn at 9 p.m. I think it's appropriate now for me to ask for a motion to approve our minutes for May 26th, 2021.
I second.
Okay, all in favor, raise your hand any way you want to. I believe that's been approved. Thank you. Public participation. Do we have any members of the public who would like to speak?
See any.
No, we don't.
Hearing the sound of the wind, but not a person. Let's check our participant list. I don't see any members of the public listed on the participants. Does that look right to you, Corey?
That is correct. We do not.
Okay. I believe then we can move on to our next agenda item. And we'll start with this overview from Jay Sudet and Ian Swallow. So take it away, gentlemen.
Let's see. There we go. Hey, everybody. So this is a presentation that Ian Baum and I gave to planning board a couple of months ago, and I thought it might be extremely helpful. Some of it's going to be kind of basic for some of you, but maybe not, but it might be a good refresher. But I think the piece from Ian will be really interesting, just in terms of the inner workings of how affordable housing gets funded, and give you some in-depth, greater knowledge of how that works. So I'm going to start with some highlights and successes in terms of the city's policies, specifically what the city's role, and then, as I mentioned, Ian's going to talk more about the financing piece, development and finance. So I think everybody is familiar with what the problem is and why it's a problem. So the bottom blue line is basically area median income. Hasn't changed a whole lot in the past 20 to 30 years, whereas housing prices have been climbing steadily, in particular since 2010. So the middle of red line is attached, and the really shocking number is the detached homes. So this is sales price data that comes from BARA, and we track this every year, as well as the household income. And you'll see this graph also in the city's community profile that we publish on an annual basis as well. So the rental situation is very similar. Data is not as reliable, but gives you a sense that rents are increasing, although renting in Boulder is still significantly more affordable than purchasing a home. As we all know, it's really when people make that or try to make that transition from renting to owning that a lot of people are challenged. So also, I thought it was important to talk about some definitions. So when I talk about affordable housing, it's different than what sort of the industry standard is. So the industry standard for affordable housing means you pay no more than 30% of your income on housing. So what in the city of Boulder, permanently affordable housing is really what we're talking about when we talk about affordable housing often. And that means it's deed restricted to ensure permanent affordability in perpetuity. So there's a deed restriction on the property. And that applies to both rental and ownership units. Area median income. So I think you all know this, half of the people make more, half of the people make less. In 2021, it was just over 103,000. There are also lots of different sort of definitions of income levels out there. I won't go into all the subcategories. The city, for simplicity purposes, we talk about low, moderate, and middle income. And that's really what our 15% goal is based on. And that low is 0 to 60, moderate 61 to 80, and as you can see, middle. And the nice thing about the AMI recently is that you can just, that 30% AMI is roughly a household of 3 earning 30,000. So it's kind of easy to remember it that way. And also, if you guys have questions, jump right in because I can't see you all on my screen. Please feel free to interrupt me.
Hey, Jay, just so you know, the presentation I think is in, again, I don't know if everybody can like see the notes in the PowerPoint.
You can see my notes. Yeah.
It's kind of a funky, I don't know if it's full screen. I don't know if everybody can see that.
Weird. What am I doing now?
I think you go to display settings, Jay.
I'm going to try again. Come on, technology. Resume slideshow? What? Oh, I don't know.
What if you press F5? Do you have an F5 key on your computer? F5 is the shortcut key for presentation mode. No, I guess that didn't work.
All right, one more time. It did work, but it showed somewhere else. Here we go. How's that?
Perfecto.
All right. So I think as you all know, we've been making pretty significant progress towards achieving our goal. Last year we had 277 units, which was probably the second best year on record. So we've been doing quite well. And in addition to, now it's not advancing for some reason. There we go. You see that?
Yes.
All right. I've done this before, to believe it or not, flawlessly. Okay, so in addition to the 277 units this year, we have just over almost 1,000 units in the pipeline that we hope to be building over the next, say, 1 to 7 years. And another big piece that's kind of has evolved in the past several years is that a push for permanent supportive housing. So if you recall, permanent supportive is for people transitioning from being unhoused, provides more wraparound services like mental health services, addiction services. So there's been a big push that all of our new affordable projects provide at least a certain percentage of units as permanent supportive. All right, it's working. So there we've been accomplishing this goal through a combination of regulations, policy, as well as investment. So those regulations that everyone's familiar with, inclusionary housing, that 25% requirement, that all new housing has to be permanently affordable. We also have commercial linkage fees on new commercial development. So we have, last I checked, we still had the second highest commercial linkage fees in the country. I think other California communities are catching up quickly, but you'll see that's providing a significant source. And annexation. So annexation, our primary community benefit, as you recall, is that typically anywhere from 40 to even 60% of any new development has to provide 40 to 60% of those units have to be permanently affordable. We have a number of strategies and policy in place. We'll talk about the middle income strategy next month. You just reviewed the manufactured housing strategy that builds upon the state provisions. And preservation has also been a big push in the past, say, 5 to 7 years. The idea is instead of focusing most of our efforts on building new in areas of city that are growing, this really helps us to purchase existing housing stock and convert it into permanently affordable in perpetuity. So that's been a big shift in our policy. And that investment that we're going to talk more about really allows us to use those local funds and federal funds and leverage it. And we couldn't do all this without all of our partners. So Boulder Housing Partners is, of course, our primary partner, very important. But we also have other nonprofits. We have even private developers providing non-affordable housing. And keep in mind, the city does not own or operate affordable housing. We rely solely on our partners. Don't ask me about Ponderosa with that statement. So funding sources, as I mentioned, those commercial linkage fees, 11%. So that's been growing over the past couple of years. Federal funds have been shrinking. So the linkage fees have kind of been filling that gap. Property taxes, about a quarter of our funding comes from the local property tax. But cash in lieu is still the bulk source of funding for affordable housing. And as you can see, over the last 6 years, just over $66 million has been collected. And that cash in lieu and the commercial linkage fees, this just gives you a sense of how variable they are year to year. You know, some years are really big, some years are fairly small. 2016, it really has to do with the market, has to do with timing of projects. And it almost seems like there is no real rhyme or reason, but just wanted to highlight that for you. But as you can see, linkage fees are becoming more important in terms of our funding source. And how we use that is that we combine a lot of different sources that come in. And we are able to leverage those to basically, for every dollar that we spend in local money, we can leverage $2 to $3 of outside money, either through the state or the federal. And Ian will talk about that, the low-income housing tax credits. And those funds are very competitively distributed to our affordable housing providers. We sometimes hear from people that we have all this money just sitting around, not going towards affordable housing. But I guarantee you that the funding requests that we get exceeds available funds on an annual basis. And I would say one of the great things about funding is that it allows us to provide deeper affordability, right? So if we were, say, to get rental projects on site and the developers would provide all of those units at basically 60% AMI, which is the basic requirement. So when BHP approaches a project, they will always look at, well, how do we get 50% units, 40% units, 30 and on down? Because there's definitely a need for those lower incomes as well. So that's been one of the great things that happens with it. It goes towards new construction. So as I mentioned, we have the Housing Authority, other nonprofits, private developers, the preservation that we've been talking about. So some examples, Tantra, the Nest, if you're familiar with those. And then programs. It's not enough just to get somebody in an affordable home. There is a lot that goes into educating future owners in the program, helping with people to maintain those homes over time, particularly if they're very low income or fixed income. And sometimes the homeowners get in trouble and we have to bail them out from foreclosure. It's still beneficial to the city, even if we have to invest a little bit of additional money to keep that home in the program. So like I said, feel free to interrupt me if you have any questions. And then land banking. So recent examples, Halo Parkway, 30 Pearl was land banked for quite some time. We just recently purchased a lease option for 20 acres in the planning reserve. BHP just recently purchased 6,500 Odell up in Gun Barrel. So you're going to hear more about land banking from Ian probably, just because they have so many projects in the pipeline. They just don't have the staff capacity to actually fulfill them all at this time, which is a really great problem to have. So those regulations and the policies and investments have had some really tangible outcomes. So this is an interesting analysis we did. So out of every 100 new units that could get created in Boulder, so focus on the inner circle, 81 of those are market rate and 19 are permanently affordable. So some of those are provided on site, but the vast majority of those are provided through funding and whatnot. And in addition to those 19, every year we're getting about 17 through preservation. And again, this is on average over a 5-year period, but it just shows that the policies and regulations and investment combined are making significant progress. And another benefit of the funding as well, as you can see, the units that we have are fairly well distributed throughout the city. And if we rely solely on getting development or affordable units through new development, that map would look very differently. So it's that preservation piece. It allows us to land bank, and that's going to allow us to spread out those units across a broader spectrum of the city. And then on the website, there's, I'm sure we've all like biked by, walked by, driven by projects in Boulder. We have no idea where we're actually permanently affordable. So we have on our website a similar list like this, and it shows you samples of projects throughout Boulder, pictures, how many units at what AMI, if you really want to dig into the details. But the whole idea is that these funding sources help provide a very diverse set of housing in the city. And then before I turn it over to Ian, I just wanted to, this is an analysis we did, well, that was like 3 or 4 years ago, definitely pre-pandemic, comparing some market rate projects with affordable projects. So the affordable projects are in green at the top, the market rate are purple. You can see the affordable projects are typically smaller in number. Michael, you have a question?
Yes, I do, but why don't you finish with this panel and then I'll ask it.
Sure. So you can see the affordable projects are typically smaller than the market rate. What we wanted to show were sort of the number of public meetings, the changes that are made through the development review process, and all the community benefit that's provided. And, you know, this was kind of in response to some concerns we were hearing from the community that affordable projects were getting special treatment from the city. And as Ian can attest, you know, we put affordable projects through the ringer just like market rate development. And even more so, I think we almost hold them to a higher standard in some respects. So I just wanted to share some of this. Before we turn it over to Ian, why don't we start with Michael's question?
Thank you, Jay. I've been hearing about all the new money for housing that's going to be coming in as a result of various relief acts. Has the city started to assess what piece of the pie that we might get and how that might be applied?
Yes, I do know that those conversations have started. I do not know where they've landed. And I'm pretty sure they have not landed. But affordable housing, I would say, is definitely in the mix. What percentage of that, I really couldn't speculate. But
Yeah.
once we know, I will definitely share that information. Because
Yeah, I've been hearing, and this is a little anecdotal, I apologize, that the funding available in the next, I guess, fiscal year is going to be like 10 times what's out there for this year. And that, it'll be maybe a one-time infusion, but that could really create a significant amount of new housing in communities throughout.
yeah, it's very exciting. Any other questions? Any other reactions? I mean, was this interesting, useful, helpful?
Yes, I would love to get a copy of it if it's okay.
I had a
Totally.
question, Jay.
Go ahead.
I was curious on the linkage fees. Did the geography expand for that? The boundary that the city imposed, where new businesses would be asked to pay a commercial linkage fee at some point?
It's citywide. Are
Is
you
it citywide?
Are you thinking of the community benefit, allowing development to have additional height or intensity?
Maybe that's it. I just
Specific
thought there was
areas.
like a boundary, linkage fee boundary within the city limits. 28th Street and West or something like that, but it's all over the city.
All new commercial development, and it was phased in over 3 years, and either this year or last year, it's fully phased in.
Okay, so I guess what we're seeing, so there was more of the commercial linkage as a part of the distribution in the later years because it was fully phased in by then.
Exactly.
Okay, gotcha.
Yeah, so it'll be interesting to see that graph in say 2 or 3 years to see if that becomes our dominant funding source.
Yeah, it'll be interesting.
Remains. But I was surprised. I was expecting it to be less cash in lieu and more linkage fee, but it's kind of held steady.
Sorry, Jay, another quick question. Do you have any analysis of how low-income tax credits have been leveraged in Boulder to help create some of this housing? And related to that, other tax structures like opportunity zones, anything happening in that department?
I mean, Ian can talk more about how they utilize low-income tax credits. I mean, they do it for pretty much all of their projects. The opportunity zones, that's interesting. I haven't heard discussion about that in quite some time. I would have to get back to you on that.
Yeah, I haven't heard of any affordable housing being developed as a result of that, but I thought maybe someone else had.
Yeah, Ian, do you know?
Yeah, I mean, I can speak to that a little. I have not, obviously, as a little feedback there. As a nonprofit kind of developer, we don't really benefit from opportunity zones. And what we've seen is that the investors who are investing in the low-income housing tax credit are not really interested in the opportunity zone. It's not really an incentive for them. It's kind of a different tax benefit than what they would find useful. On the market rate side, I know that there's been some rumblings, but I honestly have not heard of any projects that are specifically developing as a result of that opportunity zone legislation, at least in Boulder specifically. Other places, I think there has been a little more action in those areas, but I have not heard it specifically in Boulder. So.
I would agree with that.
Jay,
Yeah.
Just a question from you. I just wanted to understand. Well, I have two questions, maybe. The first one is around between the cash in lieu versus the just lost the name of the other option for the funding.
Social linkage fee?
The linkage fee.
Uh-huh.
It came back to me. Yeah. So the caption versus linkage fee, we saw on the graph there that there's this great increase. Do you, I mean, I know that's a balance between how much property is developed from which we can collect linkage fee, as well as the increase probably in linkage fees. Do you have a sense of, because that was quite a jump. It seemed like it was more than just the increase in percentage. And I know, like you said, they're hard to peg anything to. Any sense of how much of that is based on the increase in the fee versus just more development that pays the fee?
No, I mean, that's
Does
the
that
problem.
make sense?
It's just comparing only 1 or 2 years worth of data
Yeah.
to see a trend. Like I said, I think it'll be really interesting in 2 or 3 years to go back and look at it.
Okay.
But I would say it's a combination.
And
I
then,
think it's a combination of that there's been quite a bit of commercial development and the fees
Right.
fully implemented. We thought that a lot of people would be jumping ahead, trying to get in under the lower fees. And I think that did happen a little bit, but we still have people coming in with the fully implemented fees. So
that didn't seem to be a deterrent particularly.
No.
I mean, we'll know with more years under our belt, like you said. The other question, just so I understand it correctly, is the graphic that you showed with market rate new and then permanently affordable units. And you had there were 19 permanently affordable, and then you had the 17 that were preservation. So when we look at that, are we really looking at, like, if I understand that correctly, 36 units out of, well, this would be out of every 117 units we're getting 36 to 81 is kind of the balance that we're getting. Is that how I understand that?
have to be a little careful with this graph. So the 100 units is all new. So that's why it's an outside circle. So we are getting 19 affordable units out of those new 100 new, but of the existing stock, we're transitioning those from market rate to affordable.
Right. So that's, yeah. Okay. That answers my question. That's why I just wanted to make sure I was understanding that correctly. Okay. Thanks.
Anyone else before we get?
Yeah, first things, then functionally, it's essentially like 3664 when you put in the preservation that comes after the fact with the existing units, right? So that's why that's on that outside circle, but it has the effect of bringing that 81 down to 64 is the way I looked at that, right?
Well, I would be careful doing that. That's all.
Okay, all right. But I just wanted to
64
say,
implies it's all new.
I think this is great. I really appreciate it. I think it would be really great if we had some sort of just regular updates on some of these things once in a while, and not necessarily just for the members of the board, but whomever may be attending. And this is really, I liked how this is very direct and concise, and this is, and I'm sure it is made available to the public, but if there is some way for more people, it just seems to me a lot of people don't understand what's going on. I think it's pretty comprehensive and it's very commendable, especially compared to other communities. Nothing's perfect, and this is a daunting challenge for everybody that's just growing more and more. But having something like this so the public understands what's going on, the steps that are taken, and how they can better support it, I think would be a wonderful step, because I think it is distills it down to some very specific information in slides or PowerPoints, whatever it is. And yeah, that was great. So I appreciate it. I love a copy too.
Yep, it'll get posted on the website, like all our presentations. Anyone else before we move on to the main attraction? All right, go ahead, Ian.
Perfect. Thanks, Jay. Do you want me to share my screen, or do you want to run slides here?
You can also request control, I think.
All right, let me see if I can.
Or just tell me when you want to advance.
I'll try this. Let me see. You guys let me know when this looks presentation mode here.
You had no problem with that. I don't know why I did.
That looks good.
This looks good. Great. Well, thanks everyone. Jay, you want to mute yourself? I think I'm getting feedback from you. Perfect. Well, I'm Ian Swallow with Boulder Housing Partners. Thanks for having us, of course. Gonna just give a little presentation today on kind of who BHP is, what our role is in the city, and kind of the main tools we have for developing affordable housing in Boulder. So usually we like to start these presentations off just with a little bit of info on BHP. So we are the housing authority for the city of Boulder. So Boulder Housing Partners is just a DBA doing business as. We are independent from the city. So that's a question we get a lot. We get our authority from state statute. We have a 9-member board that is appointed by city council, but operates fully independently of city council with our own executive director and kind of full staff. So that is just a little bit about kind of who BHP is and how we're set up. Looking at kind of who we serve and what that demographic looks like in the city of Boulder, you can see we serve about 1,800 households currently. I think this data is from last April, so fairly current. And then you can see just some of the highlights. Certainly, our highest kind of folks we serve are households with children, and then a significant number of both seniors and people living with disabilities. And then, looking at the bottom of this graphic, you'll see that we're really serving kind of those most in need and kind of some of our most vulnerable citizens. So median income for those 1,800 households is just under $16,000 a year. So, you're looking at less than $1,500 a month in income. And that equates to about 74% of who we're serving is at 30% AMI or less. So we certainly strive to meet those most in need. I think you can really see that in these numbers here in terms of who we're currently serving. Transitioning a bit, so some of the pieces I wanted to get into today. These are just touching on kind of all the ways BHP is involved in affordable housing in the city. So obviously new construction, so going out and building new affordable housing. We're currently just wrapping up our 30 Pearl project right at 30th and Pearl. So that's a great example. Acquisition, we're always looking to purchase existing housing stock. I think, you heard Jay touch on that piece a bit, but that's an important part of what we do, both to, preserve kind of some of that naturally occurring affordable housing in the city, and then also acquire some, communities that we think are a good fit for what where we're seeing the need. Land banking, Jay also mentioned where we're going out and just acquiring land or other buildings or properties that we don't necessarily see as immediate development potential, but we know and 3, 5, 10 years are going to be really, really good to own and be a great opportunity for new housing. Renovation, another important piece. We were chatting just kind of before this began about some of BHP's recent renovations. So that's, maintaining our existing portfolio. We're up to about 1,600 units total in the city currently. So that's important that we are being good stewards of those existing communities. And then finally, partnerships. So that's, working with the city. It's working with, we have a ton of great private developers who are creating affordable housing, as well as our nonprofits. So, folks like Boulder Shelter for the Homeless. We've done good partnerships with private developers, the Ciclo community, which is over on just about Valmont and Foothills. That was a partnership with Element Properties that was a good way to get some new housing. So those are kind of all the ways we're currently touching affordability and affordable housing in the city. transitioning here, so getting more into the funding, wanted to touch a little bit on kind of the big funding tool that BHP uses and really nationally is the primary tool to create new affordable rental housing, and that is the low-income housing tax credit. You'll see it commonly abbreviated here, LIHTC or LIHTC. You'll often hear it referred to as. This is a federal program, actually came out of the, I guess, most recent tax reform law prior to 2017, which was in the mid 80s, and really came out of a desire to replace direct subsidies from the federal government. So that was really the public housing program where you had HUD and the federal government directly building affordable housing. Results of that were certainly mixed. You had, large scale projects in big cities that are, pretty widely viewed now as having been a failure of public policy. And so the low income housing tax credit program was implemented to really replace that. And what it does is bring in a private entity as an investor into the partnership that ultimately builds and owns this housing. So they get basically a dollar for dollar tax credit against their federal income tax liability in exchange for providing upfront funding for affordable housing. So the simplistic way of how that works is a project will be awarded a certain amount of tax credits that it's eligible for. An investor will then pay us, current pricing you'll see here is between about 88 and 95 cents on the dollar. So they're basically getting the return plus a little more of that difference. So that between 5 and 12 cents per dollar of tax credit as an incentive for investing in the housing is how the low-income housing tax credit program works. A little more detail here. So important piece that often folks don't realize with it, but the tax credit program is actually administered by the IRS. It's a tax credit, so it sits under them rather than HUD. They allocate tax credits annually to state agencies. So in Colorado, that's the Colorado Housing and Finance Authority, often shortened to CHAFA. It's based on population, so it's a per capita calculation that's done. And then CHAFA basically administers those tax credits in the state of Colorado. So you'll see in the diagram here, they will receive proposals. So it's a competitive process. There are 2 application rounds per year. So developers submit applications. If CHAFA likes them, they get awarded tax credits. You'll see on the bottom, then those tax credits will flow to the investor as their benefit. In exchange, we'll get some funding to help build the housing. We'll also take out a loan. So just like, you might have a mortgage on your house, the affordable housing we build all has debt on it. So lender will issue a loan that is supported by the rent that we charge to the residents. And then, kind of the third piece of the pie is grants. So for us, the largest funder of that is certainly the city of Boulder. It's that cash in lieu and linkage fee money at work. And that is a kind of a critical piece for us in terms of how we finance our communities. If that wasn't complicated enough, we add in, there are actually 3 different types of tax credits that we currently have access to. So there are 2 federal tax credits. One is the 9% tax credit. You'll see on the left, that's kind of the most valuable and the most competitive. That equity typically brings about 70% of the funding that we need to build the housing. The complement to that on the federal side is the non-competitive 4% piece. So that is a tax credit that basically the federal government has agreed to issue in any amount. There's no cap on it. There end up being some ways that it's capped that are a little in the weeds, but that brings about 30%. So that resource typically has to get paired with something else to be viable, because you're only able to get about 30% of the kind of total capital you need to build the housing out of that. So The third and kind of final tax credit is actually the state of Colorado affordable housing tax credit. So this is relatively new. I think the first year for this was back in maybe 2016 or 2015. It's currently extended at the state level through 2025. So works exactly the same as the federal credit. The state of Colorado basically gives investors a tax credit against their state income tax liability in exchange for funding for housing. So that ends up getting paired with the 4% non-competitive and gets you a lot closer, that 45 to 60% you see there in equity that helps to build the housing. So those are kind of the three flavors of tax credits that are currently available. I will just quickly pause there in case any immediate questions. I have some more examples of how this works in some hypothetical projects, but any initial questions on the tax credit piece? All right. I will, go ahead.
So is it trending in any direction between those three options? Is one starting to get utilized more, or is it just pretty much stasis right now?
Yeah, that's interesting. So it's, typically you see the list of applications all, basically they're all oversubscribed. We typically see about 3 to 1. So, there's funding requests for about 3 times as much money as is available. I can tell you in Boulder, the last 9% BHP had was probably over 10 years ago at this point. So we have almost exclusively been using the 4% and state tax credit combination to fund our projects. The reason for that is there's a cap on the amount of 9% tax credits that CHFA will award for a specific project. And we tend to see higher construction costs and just higher development costs for our projects in Boulder. So what that does is we quickly exceed that cap to the point where a project isn't feasible with the 9%. I think, we're always looking at it. It tends now to be smaller communities. So, 30, 40, 50 units rather than the 60, 70, 80 units, which is what you'll see more commonly with the 4% and state combination. So that's certainly been the trend in Boulder. I think, demand for all of it has exceeded supply consistently for a long time. So.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right. I will keep moving here. This is just a quick slide to show you some of the things CHFA is looking at when they're kind of evaluating projects. So everything from, location, what's the transit like? Obviously, what's the need? Who are you serving? They want to look at, what's the population that you're serving? Are there any special populations? Energy efficiency has been a big focus in the last couple of years. So we certainly are good at that in Boulder. The city has a very strict energy code, so that's always looked at favorably by CHFA. And then this last point, readiness to proceed, which is really, how quickly after an award are you able to pull a building permit, start construction, and bring that housing to the market, is a very important one. So something we're always very cognizant of. This slide we really included when we did our the same presentation for planning board, who's often reviewing our projects, but this is our kind of internal Venn diagram, but timeline for the city of Boulder's kind of entitlement process to take a project from we bought a piece of land, we're ready to start designing, through a full building permit. So, we're currently seeing that's probably about a 2-year process, just based on current timelines. So the city has quite a rigorous review process, which is, certainly a good thing, I think, for the vast majority of cases. But this is kind of what we're navigating through when we're preparing to go to CHFA, because they're always looking at that readiness to proceed. How far along in this process are we, and how close are we to being able to pull a building permit for any given application? So that's kind of what the city process looks like currently.
Hey, Ian, this is Juliet. I had a question just on the last slide.
Yeah.
So with respect to housing need and characteristics, how is it determined, like the housing types? You mentioned that a large proportion of the clients that you serve have children, and then there's another proportion that people with special needs. And I would imagine the housing types of those two groups would be quite different. The style of housing and there people have housing preferences, and we hear
Right.
that's why people leave Boulder at a certain, in a certain demographic profile. How does that get determined? Because it's a little subjective, right? In terms
Yeah,
of
absolutely. So
how does that
yeah,
work?
yeah, good question. And I actually have some future slides that I think will kind of show you how BHP is looking at it, what we're seeing in the market in terms of just demographics and where the demand is. But so for CHAFA, it's a very kind of black and white process. So, we'll propose a project. So BHP will look at, what demand have we seen? Where are we seeing kind of the highest need? We'll, kind of create a program around that. And then CHAFA requires a third-party market study. So we go out and hire a market analyst. They basically determine, here's the market area, and do a very, analytical review of there are this many households in that market area. There are this many at that income strata. These are the comparable properties. These are the amenities at those properties. And develop what's known as the capture rate, which is a big item for CHAFA, which is basically, how many people out of the pool of potentially eligible households would you need to capture to fully lease your property. So they're looking at it from a very they don't want you building a bunch of 3-bedroom units if your market area only has single households who are not going to qualify for those units. So for them, it's a very kind of cut and dry, analytical driven process that we have to hire an analyst to perform.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right, so these next few slides are just going to be a couple examples just to kind of illustrate the power of the low-income housing tax credit and how it works in practice. So very simple kind of 50-unit example project. At the top there, you'll see kind of sources of funding. The bottom are the uses of funding. So, land, hard costs, which is, kind of our construction, developer fee, soft costs, so things like architects and engineers. So hypothetical 50-unit project, you can see at affordable rents, we could take out approximately $5.5 million in debt. We might be able to go get $1 million in grants. So from the city of Boulder, from the state, from Boulder County. But it's, going to cost us a little over $19 million to build those 50 units, which leaves us with, a tremendous gap of about, we're about $12.5 million short in this, kind of simple calculation here. So, clearly not feasible. When we add, tax credits into the mix here, kind of that new table on the right, you can see for that hypothetical project, tax credit equity would bring about $11 million to the project up front, which basically would almost entirely fill our gap. And so then you can see, using the city of Boulder, that's really that cash in lieu money and some additional outside grants, we're suddenly able to be at the point where we have a project that works. But the key, in all of our communities is that tax credit equity. So that is certainly the largest driver of our budgets in terms of what the percentage it makes up, which you can see there on the right. Same project, just adding in that equity makes all the difference in something getting built. And then, to get a little more nuanced on that piece, this shows a little bit the impact of density I think it's something we always are looking at. It's always, can be controversial topic. It can be, something that is, difficult at planning board hearings and those things, but it's super important for us in terms of feasibility of our project. So this just compares a theoretical 50 and 60 unit project on the same piece of land. So on the left, you can see all the same sources and uses from the previous slide. If you're at 50 units, you're looking at, with tax credit equity, we would need about $1.9 million from the city to make a project work. If we were able to, say, add 10 units to that same community, you'll see the total cost is going to go up, but so is the total tax credit equity. So that second line from the top, you'll see an increase in the 4% state tax credit. And then what that allows us to do is the two lines below where you see City of Boulder and outside grants, we can reduce those asks pretty significantly. So you see, city theoretically would be able to ask for about $700,000 less, which is $700,000 that can go to another project. And the same thing in the outside grants portion. So this is really something that we try to be really cognizant of. And this just gets to, the real driving factor here is what's the total cost per unit of housing that you're building. That's a big metric we see tracked at CHAFA. So density allows us to really lower that cost per individual unit when you're controlling for kind of like, same piece of land, just with the ability to add units. It's certainly beneficial in providing affordability. Switching gears a little bit to the acquisition side, this, again, just illustrating on the left, new construction, you can see kind of our sources of funds. You'll see, debt grants and tax credit equity. The piece where we really struggle with acquisitions, we can certainly go take out a loan against an existing apartment building. There's, rent to support that. We can certainly go get funds from the city and others. The piece that we struggle with is bringing in the tax credit equity. So we've been able to be creative in a few instances and be able to buy some larger kind of apartment communities, and then in the future renovate them and bring in that tax credit equity. But it's certainly a nut that's difficult to crack when we're looking at acquiring existing buildings, just because we're missing about a third of the pie there to make everything pencil out. All right, let's see. Juliet, this I think will also kind of help on some of the household data that we're seeing recently in terms of how we go about thinking about, projects and unit mix and who we're trying to serve. So all of this data has come from recent market studies we've done for specific communities. So this you can see it's from Canopy, which is a project that was just completed about this time last year. And you can see, what's kind of the makeup of renter households in the Boulder area. So you can
Does
see.
this include students?
Good. Yeah, so it's a great question, and one I actually dug into after our planning board presentation. So this would exclude students who are living in like a group living setting. So that's, dorms, sororities, fraternities, or anything that's classified as group living. It would include anyone living in like private rental housing. So obviously, significant portion of CU probably lives in private rental housing. It's super difficult to quantify. Did a student respond to this census data saying they live in Boulder or saying they live in wherever they're from? Certainly difficult to parse out, but that is what this data shows. So I think there is probably a skew for students in this when you see the one person household size, but it also, it does not account for all of it either, I would say. But you can see, largest percent of renters is certainly in the smaller household sizes. About 70 to 75% is at that 1 and 2 person household size that we're seeing, and pretty consistent from 2017 projected forward to 2022. Taking that a little more nuanced, so this basically takes those same numbers and then applies income. So who would be basically eligible for affordable housing, and we see it's pretty consistent. So about 70% of the total households earning less than 60% AMI would be 1 and 2 person households. But we also are looking at over 20% that are in the 3 and 4 person household size as well. So certainly need across the board. We've seen lately that highest proportion is in that smaller household size. And it's certainly been where the demand has been for our units in the last couple of years.
Again, we wouldn't, it'd be hard to parse out the students living in private rentals and what their income is.
Right.
I would guess it'd be pretty low.
Right. You would certainly assume, and it is, it's definitely a struggle for the analysts who do this work. And I would say and I'm not sure, let me see if I have a future slide on this. But anecdotally, and who we end up seeing on our wait list, it is skewing in those smaller households more recently. Even though you saw on an earlier slide, we're primarily serving households with children. A lot of those are tend to be smaller households with children, so it can be single parent with 2 kids, single parent with 1 kid. But it's been an interesting kind of data point that we've seen evolving over the last couple of years. So this is, kind of Boulder-wide market data that came from our 30 Pearl market study. So this is looking at both, anything affordable and then market rate and where we're seeing vacancy rates at. So this would have been probably about for 2019. So again, it's, it's kind of showing that the 2 and 3 bedroom units are just not seeing as much demand as the smaller units. Certainly those are low vacancy rates across the board. When you would compare that to other communities, we do not have high vacancy in Boulder, but the demand has really been more at that smaller unit size, at least recently.
Hey, Ian, I'm sorry to keep asking questions.
No, you're good.
Those 2 and 3 bedroom, do we know what kinds of developments those are situated in? Are they in primarily in high density development where you might see 2 and 3 bedrooms, or are they in other neighborhoods where it's more of a duplex or a triplex?
Yeah, it's a good question. The data is probably not that nuanced to break that down. I would say, again, just anecdotally knowing seeing market rate projects come through, there have really not been a lot of market rate with the 3 bedroom units. There's certainly some with 2 bedroom, but it's pretty rare to see new market rate rental providing the 3 bedrooms, which would be more in that, higher density, more like an apartment building. So I would guess it's a pretty fair representation across the board. It would include some of those, duplexes or townhomes, things like that. But the data is just doesn't get into that, unfortunately.
Thanks.
Yeah. And then this is showing just kind of, unit size across our portfolio compared to kind of market rate units that had been built since about between, I think, about 2018 and 2020. So you can see, both BHP and the market are mostly providing 1 and 2 bedroom units, but you will see, BHP, when you look at the 3 and 4 bedroom units, significantly more than what the market has been providing. So the demand has not been as high for those units, but it's obviously not zero. And our mission is obviously to serve anyone in need of affordable housing in Boulder. So we certainly do have a number of 3 and 4 bedroom units. Those are, we try to always have a diversity of housing types throughout the city. So whether that's up in North Boulder and Holiday and it's more of a townhouse style unit, or you're in South Boulder and it's stacked flat, but it's a 3-bedroom. We try to have a variety of unit types kind of throughout the city and throughout our portfolio to kind of serve all those demographics where we're seeing them. And Juliet, this is, kind of, I guess, reinforcing that point about, new market rate has been 3-bedroom units have been basically non-existent in the past couple of years, just from what I've seen. And, you can see it in this data as well.
And these are for rent and for sale.
This would just be for rent on the market unit sides. Yep. So this is just for rent. We have seen, I mean, there's certainly been some new construction for sale, but not at any kind of scale recently. So we have not seen large new condo developments. But Boulder certainly does not have a land use pattern that would have, larger subdivisions being added where you're adding 400 for sale units, anything like that. So that's been a different market in terms of what is getting provided. It's been almost exclusively new rental in the last couple of years. Switching gears again, wanted to just touch on a point that Jay brought up, which is permanently supportive housing, and kind of how BHP is working to provide housing for folks exiting homelessness. So, we've really come about it in a number of ways. You'll see the picture kind of in the top right there is our Lee Hill community up in North Boulder, right across the street from our office. So that's 31 units. It's 100% permanently supportive housing. So each unit there is occupied by a formerly homeless client. A lot of on-site services, all in one building. We have also been in the last couple of years working to provide supportive housing units that are kind of more dispersed through the community and through our portfolio. So you'll see a lot of our new construction projects will have a percentage of the units that are set aside for supportive housing. So, anywhere between 10 and 25%. So for instance, 30 Pearl, which is just wrapping up in the next couple of months, we have 10 supportive housing units there where we partner with the Boulder Shelter for the Homeless to provide services. And we really do the same thing when we acquire existing buildings. A lot of times that's a really good way to get people housed quickly when we're able to acquire a new building and provide some supportive housing there. And then finally, the city has provided some local funding. So it's a voucher program for supportive housing units that mimics kind of the housing choice voucher, often known as Section 8, which is the federal subsidy that's largely available. So we do administer a number of those City of Boulder vouchers for supportive housing clients in Boulder. This is a good slide. I think an important one. I think, we have really heard lately, and it's, impossible to miss, I think the home ownership piece and that low and moderate income home ownership piece. So BHP, we have traditionally we build, own, and maintain our own rental housing. That's what basically housing authorities' mission is and what you'll find most housing authorities do. We have certainly been interested in looking at home ownership, especially just given the gap that's really developed in Boulder for that piece. And this slide is really just to show kind of the hurdle that we run into there. So the left, you'll see basically that bar is showing what, typical cost you could expect to provide a 3-bed, 2-bath kind of single family home, even a townhouse, something like that. So we're seeing, land is coming in currently where we see about $100,000 per unit for the land cost. Construction costs have been definitely trending up, and then infrastructure entitlements, so that's going through the city process, and financing costs. So all in, we're seeing a cost to build a unit or a home like that is probably in the $550,000 to $600,000 range. Surprising to a lot of people. You look at the market and you can see, oh, I can buy that in Westminster you can buy something for $400,000. but really, the cost for new construction is pretty prohibitive. Part of the reason when you see new, for sale construction in Boulder, it's a lot of scrape offs, and then you'll see, $1 million+ homes for sale on that. This is the reason why. And on the right, what you'll see is basically, what would be affordable for someone earning at the various AMI levels. So the bottom, you'll see somebody at 60%, which is, the upper limit of the programs we run, all the way to somebody up who's, very solidly in the middle income at 120% of AMI. So there is a very real gap between what it costs to build that unit and what an affordable price is to the end user. And the piece we were missing here is the tax credit equity. So, that is the big federal resource that allows us to build affordable rental housing. And there is just not an equivalent source for ownership housing. There is certainly, funding available from the city. They run a really great home ownership program, and Boulder does better than a lot of communities in providing that low and moderate income home ownership piece. But it is, increasingly difficult to do, just given the lack of any kind of, major federal resource to do that. So not meant to be, saying this is something just we, kick aside and we'll never look at. We're actually looking at some options with some land bank parcels BHP currently owns, and trying to get creative with, maybe some modular construction and things like that to be able to provide some of that kind of middle income home ownership opportunities, because it's clearly a big missing piece. But it is definitely something that is difficult and requires some new resources and creative thinking. So wanted to be sure and touch on that piece as well. And that is it. So thanks again for having me, and happy to hang out, answer any questions or just general comments or anything like that.
So Ian, just for clarification's sake, so you're really focused on affordable ownership rather than rental, right? It looks like from everything that I've seen there. So you're more focused.
The opposite. So we're much more focused on affordable rental. So that's all we, I guess, of course, we wouldn't own affordable ownership, but basically, we own and manage all of the affordable rental housing in the city. We do not, at least currently, we're working on some potential options, but we do not currently provide any kind of ownership opportunities through BHP. The city, and Jay can certainly speak to that, the city does provide that piece, but BHP does not.
Okay. Thanks.
Lupita, looks like maybe a question.
Yes, thank you for seeing my raised hand. Yeah, the question I have is regarding this difference between the rental and ownership, because in the planning board it comes up often that we do not have much to offer in terms of ownership, and you just sort of answer the question. We don't have a federal program that can provide some funds to allow us to close that gap, right? So I'm wondering now, with all of this discussion with the new administration, is there any kind of program that you guys see coming down the pipeline from the federal government to provide some of those funds to improve housing? Because they do know it's a problem, countrywide. But in terms of ownership, have you guys heard any rumblings about that?
I have not. I have heard plenty of rumblings on the tax credit side and improvements to that program, but I have not heard anything on the ownership side. And it's a tough one. Traditionally, the subsidy or just kind of resource has been more on the demand side. So when the low income housing tax credit is much more trying to help on the supply side. So money comes to the developer and the owner of the housing, where we've seen federal resources that go to help home ownership has been much more targeting, like, down payment assistance for a specific household. If you remember, coming out of the financial crisis, you had like a first-time home buyer's tax credit. So it's much more focused on like funding to the individual rather than funding on the supply side, like trying to lower the cost of the housing. So, focus on giving households more resources to buy a still expensive home. The difficult part has always been, how do you give, home ownership, the person owns it, so that how do you account for that benefit and make sure it lives on, for future users? And, do you give some, you buy an affordable home, what, is there a resale restriction? How do you kind of keep that affordable? So that's always been one of the difficult pieces to crack. And I think, one of the reasons the federal government has kind of more opted to give, resources to an individual to go buy a house rather than trying to lower the cost of the house.
So following on that and going back to some of the data that you gave earlier regarding, the preponderance of the housing that we do have on the rental side being smaller numbers, I think 1 or 2 bedrooms, could it be a correlation in that, in fact, the people that are not interested in renting a 3-bedroom would rather buy a house elsewhere? Because at that point, you're talking about a real family. Because when you talk about 1 or 2 people, usually, it may be, a single person, potentially a couple, but not before they're having children potentially. So I'm just wondering if there is something, and if that issue has ever come up with the people who perform the market studies.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think that is certainly the anecdotal thing you hear in Boulder all the time, right? So folks live here, they maybe get ready to buy a house, and they end up, looking elsewhere. You kind of drive east till you can afford it, is kind of the way it's often described. We don't really look at that in our market studies. Those are, highly specific to a particular development and really meant to serve like the needs of CHFA when they're reviewing it. But it is an interesting question. Again, I think, sometimes those anecdotal stories are the case on the ground, but sometimes they're just, a result of the people we happen to interact with, rather than, the actual need there. So I don't have any hard data on that, unfortunately, but it is definitely something we hear a lot.
Yeah. So my question is what will be the right process to try to get at that data, to know that, so we can know for sure that this is not anecdotal? I mean, I do know faculty at CU who have specifically mentioned they have to go move to Superior because they couldn't afford a home here in Boulder. And so like that story, there's many other stories that we hear, but my question is there a way where we can systematically get at that information for sure, instead of, telling stories, and under whose, jurisdiction will that fall, gathering that data?
Yeah, boy, that's I am not a market analyst. That's a tough piece to try to quantify exactly for someone, individuals leaving. I think certainly the city, and Jay, I'll probably defer to you on that. I know you all probably have looked at that a little bit more, but it's difficult to quantify and actually put numbers to that kind of a situation. Jay, I don't know if you guys have done any studies or anything.
Yeah, I mean, so Peter, we did a middle income market study back in 2015. We talked a little bit about this at Planning Board not too long ago. But the thing that I would keep in mind, so there's sort of 2 different questions. So the transition from rental to wanting to buy a house, I think we established quite strongly that purchasing a home in Boulder is expensive. But I would say there is still a demand for 3 and 4 bedroom rentals in Boulder. As Ian's chart showed, they're still fully leased. There's still demand. They may take longer to lease up, but there is still demand, which is different than, is there affordable ownership opportunities?
Yeah, and so and then my question, the second one was, who will be the right kind of entity group to do an analysis on that? Is this something that the city could take on? Is it something that the planning board can suggest, or are we sort of at the mercy of when these other projects are done and people get hired, and for a very specific like these companies get hired to do the analysis, and they're frankly, I will suspect that they do just a pretty basic commercial based analysis, nothing too sophisticated to try to get at this sort of problem. And I'm wondering if that is even an option somehow. And that would be my last question.
Yeah, so Lupita, I would say yes, it is. I would just be really clear as to what the question is that you want answered.
Yes, that there's no alternative within the city or to find out who will be able to do an analysis like that we were talking about.
Okay. Other hands? Who's next?
I had my hand raised, but I'll defer if somebody else who's next in line.
I'll go ahead and go since I
Okay,
have my
great.
hand up. Ian, you touched on CHAFA and the readiness component of working with them. Do you have any, how does the city work with you in that process in any like special manner? Are there any compensations for you, or are you just in the pipeline with everybody else?
Yeah, great question. We are treated like any other developer. So we go through the exact same plan review or concept review, site review, tech doc, obviously specific to a property, but we don't get any special pass. I think oftentimes some of our projects are higher scrutiny, some are not, but we have really tried in the last couple of years to be in that city process. What we don't want to do is go to CHAFA. Here's our project. It gets approved. Then we go through the city process. There's requests for changes to that from staff or from planning board or from council. And then we have to say, oh, but we got this approved by CHAFA. So, we're between a rock and a hard place. So what we've really tried to do in the last few years is get through, kind of the first main milestones of that city entitlement process before submitting to CHAFA, so that we know this is a project that the city supports, that the community supports, and then that's the budget that goes to CHAFA is for that project. So we avoid that like back and forth but we got this approved, but you want us to build this kind of process that can happen.
Okay, so you can basically front load it to the city before going to CHAFA, and that works from your perspective?
It does. And that, it's, you'll see a lot of private developers don't necessarily like to do that because it costs a lot of money to go through the city planning process. And that's, that's a risk for them. And that's something that they tend to be averse to. It's similar risk to BHP. I mean, we have to spend money before knowing that we have a project that CHAFA is going to support and approve. We've been around, we know the process really well. So we like to think we're not, we have a good sense of where what's a project that's going to work for everybody. So I think that's a key part of it as well.
Okay. All right. Thanks.
Yeah.
Great. I'm going to harp on homeownership for another moment because I know it's really important to people on this board and it may influence our work plan. But first question is a clarification. Is BHP interested in getting more involved in for sale housing? It's not restricted from doing that in any way, correct?
There is no like statutory restriction. I think it's not been something we've done a lot of lately, and that's, direction from our board. I think, generally housing authorities' role has been to serve kind of like the most vulnerable and those at that deep affordability level. I mean, you saw, $16,000 a year median income for our households. So certainly that's where I think we've been focused but we have, it'd be impossible not to hear that coming from the community as a need. So it's been something I think we've been starting to look at just to assess feasibility. Is there a way BHP can help or bring some expertise or things like that?
Mhm. And then those gaps you showed and the cost of providing housing for different AMIs that's for sale is really interesting. Would you say the primary impediment or factor driving that is land costs, or could also be other factors, regulatory, market forces?
Yeah, it's really all the above. I mean, I think the unique piece, kind of market forces, is you see that across the board. So labor has been really difficult. Not it's expensive. It's also just like number of workers, right? Like it's hard to get capacity for construction. That I think we know is probably not changing anytime soon. It's just kind of a trend across the country. Certainly the city's process for entitlements is quite rigorous compared to other communities. That, not saying that's a bad thing. I think we end up with really high quality projects as a result, but it does add cost. But the biggest piece that sets Boulder apart from other similar communities on the Front Range is that land cost piece. We are always beating the drum at Chaffa when they see our total development costs will be much higher than anyone else. And so we really have to point to how much did it cost to acquire the land, what are the additional costs that we see from the city process, from construction costs, all that stuff. So yeah.
Thank you. We might come back to that later, but thank you so much.
Yeah. Juliet, yeah.
I just, to Lupita's point, I had recently looked at the housing choice survey, and I know that was done many years ago, 2016, I think, or 2015. But something notable in there, and that was done by an outside research firm, and I'm not sure how they did their research, but something notable in there is that over half of the in-commuters that they surveyed, so this was a survey of in-commuters, had previously lived in Boulder. And of the middle income respondents that were in-commuters, 80% were living in single family homes. So to me, that indicates a preference for a single family home of in-commuters at a median income, people who had previously, and a large proportion of those people had previously lived in Boulder, because there was a lack of that housing type at a price they would want to afford or able to afford without stretching themselves so thin. So I feel like that data is there somewhere, and maybe we need to revisit that. And I don't know who does that, to your point, Lupita, who's responsible for gathering that kind of data, but we have some reference to that data and information from a survey that was done. I guess the most recent survey that was done on those profiles, unless there's something more recent, or I'm missing something.
Nope, you're not missing anything. So there was a companion piece to the housing choice survey, which was the housing market analysis. So both done by BBC, now Root Consulting. I mean, they're both great reports. We'll spend more time as HAB talking about them in August, at the August meeting, and going through those findings. But I would venture to guess that those findings still apply today. I don't think that the market has changed dramatically. I think you're just going to find it's more exaggerated than it was back in 2015. So I mean, we can update the numbers. I'm just not sure how much value there would be unless there's a new question that hasn't been answered with the previous work surfaces.
As long as people feel that data is still valid and we could extrapolate it forward, I think we need to make sure we're factoring that in as we think about housing in general in the city. That was an awesome presentation, Ian. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Thank you.
Anyone else? Lupita, do you have a new hand up, or is that the old one?
Yes, just to follow up. Thank you, Juliet. So I was looking at the chat. So thank you for the mentioning. This was also mentioned in the planning board about some of the data already indicate some of these discrepancies that we do know that likely the anecdotal data that we discuss regularly is reflected in the actual data that we got from that survey. And the question then becomes, in my mind, what do we do with that? And, because I think it has to do with interpretation. It doesn't take too many steps to kind of put these two pieces together, and you did it beautifully right now. So the question is there something in the hands of the city that could do to kind of move in that direction so we can address that gap? Because even in the way that we're planning our growth continues to be focusing and in the lower household numbers. I'm sorry, the number of people, one or two people on a household, and that we by design continue to exclude this other people that continue to drive into the city. So that problem is not going to go away. And so my question has to do, is there something somewhere that we can start looking at that problem with a little bit more eyes for action? If it's not the government, is there any other things that can be done within the city, the state, something to advocate for? That's it.
Yep.
Yeah, I think we can get to that question when we get to our priorities discussion. We've identified some of the barriers here, and the question is, which ones do we want to focus on that are not insuperable, I suppose.
And just remember, next month, August, we have on the agenda tentatively to discuss middle income and the middle income strategy, the work that the city has been doing for the past 4 years now, and sort of what's on our current work plan specifically to address middle income homeownership. So
Great. Who's going to make that presentation, Jay, if you don't mind reminding me? Oh,
me.
Good, an expert. This is a great discussion. Do you want to keep going, or should we move on to the next agenda item, which would be our retreat follow-up?
Any other questions for Ian? Because this is a unique opportunity. We're not going to have him at all the meetings. And throw in anything about BHP, anything, just throw it at him.
I just want to say thank you, Ian. That was very helpful.
Yeah, absolutely.
I actually have another question. I don't want to let you go quite yet, Ian. I'm curious about your kind of strategy as far as the land banking and what you look for, what kinds of properties you're trying to pull in under that.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a broad umbrella. So what we look for is basically anything in the city of Boulder that is, remotely possible to build housing on. I mean, that truly is kind of the situation when you look around. I mean, the city is mostly built out. So we will look at basically any property, but we have, so we go through kind of traditional methods. So we work with a brokerage that's always kind of looking for us, sending us things. We do have good relationships kind of throughout the city, so we get a fair amount of off-market inquiries. We've had a lot of success partnering with other kind of mission-focused agencies. So churches, for instance, who maybe are seeing a decrease in attendance, but want to do something mission focused with their property that they own. But yeah, I mean, we have looked at adaptive reuse sites. I'll give you an example. Our most recent kind of land bank purchase, which is the Rally Sport Fitness Center. So right over on 29th and Bluff. So again, that was one where it's was not. It's not a traditional housing site. It's not a vacant piece of land, but it was an opportunity for us and a really excellent location to work with that owner to purchase that property. So that was a great one. And yeah, all those kinds of things.
So for instance, on that one, that one, it appears anyway, I don't know what the zoning is there, but are you looking to, do you need to get through an entitlement process for zoning allowances there or variances, or how?
Yep. So that, boy, I forget exactly what it was zoned. It was either an industrial or kind of like a business general. But we did. So in that, we actually went through the site review process and got our site review approved last February. But so that's one. I mean, again, we'll typically, go under contract on a piece of property. We'll go through a concept review process at the city where we can, make a proposal. Here's generally what we're thinking. We can get some feedback from planning staff as well as planning board and council. If it's positive, we'll close on the property at that point with some confidence that yes, we'll be able to build some housing here. If it was, horrible, this is not the location for this, we typically will not close on something until we have some confidence that we could, do housing there. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I guess that's the piece that I'm wondering about, kind of that risk assessment moving through the process with the city.
Yeah.
Like,
so typically, right, our contract to buy will have a due diligence period that gives us enough time to take the property through some initial feedback from the city.
One last piece on that. Do you find that the sellers you're working with are generally looking for that kind of, for you as a buyer, so that they give you more flexibility? And do you kind of lean on that a little bit, or?
Yeah, I would say it's 50-50. I think a lot of folks reach out because they like the mission. I can tell you, we do not get a break on price. Nobody wants to give you a lower price, which is understandable, right? I mean, that's land or a building in the city of Boulder is an asset. But I think people know BHP. I think they know we're active in development, so we come to mind when someone's looking to sell some property as a potential acquisition. And then a lot of organizations, they do like that it could end up as affordable housing. So I think, that's certainly a benefit.
Good, great. I'm glad you guys are doing that, because I think we could put a little more effort into land acquisition. We did a lot for open space. We could probably do a little bit for affordable as a community. Anyway.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Thanks for that.
Ian gave the really easy example. It's not always easy. Palo Park was a big struggle. Mount Calvary was a struggle. So
it's a struggle.
Yeah.
Ian, is anything else contemplated in the planning reserve where the affordable requirements are much higher, as I understand?
Boy, I try not to touch the planning reserve and stay out of that world. But Jay probably could speak better to that from the latest comp plan updates and all of that piece. Certainly, something we would track, but I do not actually know the latest on anything planning reserve related.
Yeah, so like I mentioned, I mean, we have that 20 acres that the Department of Housing and Human Services owns, so that'll be 100% permanently affordable. There is the 40 to 60% requirement. So it will be primarily affordable. It'll be similar to sort of the Holiday or Northfield Commons example. So a mixture of market rate, affordable. But yeah, no real planning has been done. So, there's, like you all know, I think there are lots of steps that have to happen. So council would basically have to authorize a, provision of services study, and then go through a lengthy annexation process and then a lengthy planning process as well. That would be community-wide. So, but yeah, housing is definitely, I think that will be the primary focus, just like every other annexation. Anything else for Ian? Last chance. All right, thanks, Ian.
Great. Yep, thank you all.
Thank you, Ian.
Thank you.
Okay. The next agenda item is a retreat follow-up. I think we all enjoy the retreat. We made a start on prioritizing, but maybe we can have a quick debrief to start, and then we'll have further discussion. So anybody who would like to weigh in on their thoughts of what they got out of it or what they didn't get out of it, please jump in. And there were notes sent out by our facilitator.
I wasn't there, so I was hoping I would hear some.
Excuses, excuses.
You could start with how staff is doing.
Okay, well, I'll make a few observations. If you go to that document that Susan provided, a draft summary, there's a whole section on review of the role of the housing board. And the items are highlighted in red that seem to be more important to us. Those are to study and recommend the council and city manager long and short range goals, ordinances, funding priorities, and programs to address recognized housing needs. That's one bullet point. Another is to develop and recommend, with community input, innovative approaches to accomplish city housing goals, including tools for housing preservation. And the third, to advise the city council and city manager concerning the impacts of city policy proposals on housing affordability, diversity, and accessibility. I'm sorry, there is one more. To review regional housing issues and make recommendations to the city council. Now, all those, in my mind, sound fairly proactive. I only got 2 responses to the survey I sent out, so I guess I need to become a better survey writer. But one of the items on that survey was, you know, kind of getting to the existential question of why do we exist? Is it simply to answer questions from council to the best of our ability, or are we developing more of an innovative housing agenda that we are presenting to council for their consideration? So that to me is an unresolved issue, though I've gotten some interesting feedback on that. I'd be curious to see what people think.
Michael?
Yeah, go for a shot.
I mean, I think, you know, I think I've kind of landed strongly on that side of saying, you know, I would like to see our role become more proactive, somewhat more visionary, looking for the solutions and seeing on a broad scale what the city can do and bringing those things to council. I think, you know, my whole time on the board, I've been pretty clear about that position and wanting to move more in that direction. You know, and my rationale simply is that the market is overrunning us if we think that the current structures that the city uses for affordable housing are going to actually outstrip are gonna somehow outstrip the speed of the problem. We're fooling ourselves. And so without doing some creative work on our side, I just don't think we're gonna make a dent in it. I mean, I shouldn't say a dent, because I think we are making a dent, but the problem is moving faster than we are. So we're getting dropped by the leaders, and the leaders right now are essentially a market that is investor driven, I think, to a large degree in our better neighborhoods, our lower cost neighborhoods. And then a zoning, and, you know, Lupita can jump in on this one, but a zoning regimen that essentially prefers single family homes over other options. And we're losing land rapidly to the development of very large single family homes, because that is what our current code emphasizes. You know, I have a perfect example of that. I'm doing an ADU for a family who live in North Boulder on a large lot. we got through that process, and I just want to put this out there as an example of exactly kind of where I think we need to be going and things we need to suggest to council. 2 lots side by side in North Boulder, approximately the same size, and the one, both owned by elderly people. On the one side, their children happen to live in town and are able to move into the main house, so we're able to build an ADU. So that's a great example of getting another unit on a large lot. But I think that's a rare condition oftentimes. And the neighboring house, that same large lot, you know, has been sold to a developer, and it's coming down and a big house is going in. And that's generally what's happening on those lots, because that's what we allow in our code. And we need to get the flexibility. And I think we as housing board need to push council to start working on that zoning flexibility, the large lots, and says, you know what, if you've got a large lot and you're allowed 10,000 square feet in your FAR, or 8,000, whatever it is, you're allowed that FAR regardless of, you know, within certain bounds, how you're going to develop it. You can put, why don't we have 4 2,000 square foot houses on that same piece of land? So I think those are things that we need to push with council. And I don't think we're really going to start to have an impact until we start to do some of those things, because it changes the dynamic of the missing middle. If we do that, it hits it from both sides. It gives people who are being pushed out of their properties because of raising tax rates and fixed incomes the ability to utilize their properties and stay on them and not get pushed off of them. So that's where I stand on that stuff. I mean, I'm glad that we discussed it at retreat, and I'd love to see us move in that direction.
Thank you. Just summarizing before we get to Danny, if you had to bullet point that, it would be, we need to look at some zoning innovations.
We need to look at zoning innovations. Yeah.
That's great. Danny?
And I just, you know, I think Jacques and I have agreed on this for a matter of years now, and it's something that, you know, we've kind of repeatedly brought up. But I think, you know, part of the challenge here too is that as time goes on, those windows become smaller and smaller, because as the cost gets more and more prohibitive, and people, so just the exact scenario Jacques was talking about, you know, if you don't take advantage of that scenario at that particular point in time, it may, you know, move away permanently, because somebody ends up buying it that doesn't have any interest in looking at more efficiency in the use of the land. And you know, at some point in time, I think we're just running headlong into the conflict between wanting to have all these regulations that in every single way kind of constrain any introduction of density, understanding that, you know, local housing, or, you know, affordable housing has a real density implication to it, with having you know, a lot of policies saying that, you know, we really want to focus on affordable housing. And I think at some point in time, you know, we need to figure out some pathway towards this so that we can really try to effectuate as much as we can, because it gets more and more challenging month by month, particularly the last 2 years. So.
Okay. Again, another vote, it sounds like, for looking at kind of regulatory oversight. Juliet, you always have thoughtful ideas, please.
Well, I guess I would come to that from a different angle and say that we ought to be aligning our work with what the city's goals are, the council's goals. And if we have alignment, then we can be more effective and persuasive. For example, because what you guys are talking about are increasing accessibility to that missing middle right now. And so I would flip that and say, hey, council, if your focus is missing middle, here are some ideas where we think we can mitigate the missing middle, instead of saying, here are innovative ideas. By the way, this will accomplish your goal. I think if we articulate it a little differently, then maybe we'll get more traction. I don't know if that makes sense or not, but I think we have to show alignment, and I think we ought to be aligned. I mean, we don't want people moving in a million different directions. I mean, the city has people like Jay who working day in and day out to get information and accomplish goals and keep and execute what city council is directing, I think we need to be in alignment and then be creative to deliver ideas that are going to help push those goals forward.
That's really interesting. Go ahead, Jacques.
I was just going to say, I think, Juliet, I think that's exactly what I am. When I look at the city's goals in relation to housing, our goals are to do those things. And this is one way to, I totally agree with you. How we present it is of course critical. But, I suppose what I'm just saying is that if we don't look into those areas and present those ideas as potential avenues to support the city's goals, I just think that, I guess I see that as our role to say, look, these are things, council staff are overwhelmed by all kinds of things on their plate all the time. And if we don't present those things to them, obviously in a manner that aligns with our goals and the city goals, so I think that's all we're saying is that, of course, we're trying to align with the goals as housing is perceived. Now, we've recognized that the missing middle is one of those goals. I think some of the lower income and, moderate income stuff is being engaged with already fairly robustly. And I think this missing middle piece, there are some strong things that we could suggest that would improve our ability, because I do think that is the zone that in some ways is most at risk with the way this market is moving. So, yeah, I do agree with you.
What's after you?
Yeah, and just coupling off what Juliet said, I absolutely agree. But just to clarify, I think we're all on the same page. We're saying we understand we're an advisory board, and so in this advisory board, we're not, we're not setting policy. That's what the city council does. But when we want to talk about implementation of policy, I think a lot of the things that we've talked about and a lot of things that we've tried to focus on in recent times really is an implementation of policy directives as we've heard them and we understand them from the city council, like focus on middle income and focus on housing and stuff like that. So in other words, how do you keep middle income people in their homes in Boulder or give them the opportunity? These are some of the things. And it includes ADUs from a lot of different perspectives, et cetera. So, really what we're talking about here is implementation, which I believe is precisely what our charge is. And so it's really in alignment with our charge. We're not trying to set policy. We're not trying to direct things. We're just trying to say, here's how we can do it. So.
Mm-hmm. That's really interesting. I think a few months ago, I would have thought we need to be pushing harder for affordable rental housing to serve folks that work in stores, for example, a certain segment of the population. Now those projects seem to be advancing, with more support than they used to, which Lapita can certainly talk about that. But, they look at things like the Diagonal Plaza, Diagonal Crossing, Waterview, and the Gun Barrel project. There's intense controversy over those projects, but they are moving forward. So maybe it makes all the sense in the world to address the category that's not being proposed, not being built, has got special challenges, a lot of them around land and zoning, which are difficult subjects, but they are subjects you can get your arms around. And that could be maybe even evolve into a number one priority. Also meant to lead with a bit of news, and that is, I believe I read this right, Jay, Council is advertising for more applicants to have to fill our vacant positions, and we could have more firepower, if you will, perhaps before the election, which would be fantastic. Well, that's a great example of a priority. What else would jump out to you? I also like the idea that we could be proposing some innovative strategies, but not, coming out of left field with something that they're not even talking about. It will address something that's of immediate concern and on their plate.
Michael, did you get my essay response?
I did. I quite enjoyed reading it. Yeah, you were very extremely responsive to what I was asking, which I appreciated. I can try to review some of your comments, or call them up, but you might want to report on yourself. We did, we talked about the unhoused, for example. And you had some thoughts about that.
I mean, I had comments about all of the categories, and I
Right.
think that my first comment is I'm a fan of doing fewer things and doing them really, really well versus trying to do a lot of different things and only having time to do them sort of so well. And I pointed to an example of, and I know Jared Polis has implemented this process called the 4 disciplines of execution in his government. And it's a methodology that's been used by businesses all across the world that really gets everybody focused and aligned behind a few important goals. And then people set targets and metrics and work to achieve those. It's a hard thing to implement, but it's a great model for tackling some things and actually getting things done. And so, not that we have to implement that model in this format, but I'm a fan of that. And so with that in mind, I would rather look at fewer priorities and do them really well than have a lot of different priorities. And so I also have the opinion that we need to choose our priorities based on data that's pointing us to those priorities. How are we coming up with these priorities? What evidence and supported by research show that these things should be priorities? And then what are we going to pick within those? So I know that planning board, and Lupita may have a comment. I've heard from other members of planning board that middle income housing strategy is going to be a priority. And with respect to the unhoused, I think we spent a lot of time on the unhoused last year, and in listening to presentations by Kurt and others, our city really does an exemplary job of taking care of the unhoused. Of course, we can never do enough, but we have finite resources. And so we've spent a lot of time on that, and we have actually really excellent professionals working on problem solving for the unhoused currently. So where do we want to direct our time this year to solve some of the other housing problems that we have in the city? So that was my comment about the unhoused. I want to be very clear that I support focusing on the unhoused, but I think we have also an excellent system and organization in place that can always be improved, but is exemplary compared to most parts of the country. I mean, I had other comments about your questions with regard to subcommittees and listening sessions. I don't know if you want me to go into any of that, Michael, but
I didn't actually mean to put you on the spot on that one issue. I was just trying to start someplace. And I think we've already agreed. I mean, yeah, the city does do some really great programs on the unhoused, and yet it's a problem that's, with us all the time. You just can't get away from. And I think we have already agreed we need to focus on providing housing and not social services, not policing. That's not our bailiwick, and I'm personally fine with that. Yeah, I would love for you to review. And again, I just got your comments today, so I haven't had a chance to read them as thoroughly as I might have, but I thought a lot of them were excellent. So please go on with your thoughts about committees and listening sessions. Oh, I think you're muted.
sorry, I was on mute there. I'm just pulling up my notes. So my comment about subcommittees were that I find this format to be difficult to be effective with a subcommittee because we can really only have 2 people on a subcommittee. We're also stretched thin. We don't have interim meetings. We just have these monthly meetings, and so progress could be slow because of that. And we're also lay people and not professional researchers. So a lot of times the reports that we put together don't really have data that would be rigorously approved as a real methodological approach to gathering and analyzing data, or peer reviewed, and that really professional researchers are best equipped. So unless, if the city or if the subcommittee is requiring some component of research to inform its recommendations, then I would say it's hard to be effective given our format and the fact that we're lay people and we're not experts in this research, and we don't have access to resources to fund and structure this kind of research. So that was a general committee and a general comment about subcommittees. And it also dilutes our energy if we're going to all focus on a few things. So that was in the context of focusing on a few things. Should I mention the listening session comment? I don't want to speak, so take too much air here, Michael.
I heard some enthusiasm for the listening sessions at the retreat, and I think you're offering an important criticism of that. So please continue.
So I think the listening sessions have the potential to be excellent. I think that we need to be clear about what goals we're trying to accomplish with those, or are we, and I would submit that our goal should be to listen to a wide range of constituents and stakeholders and be able to provide a balanced feedback to inform the decisions that we recommend, or the recommendations to City Council. And that we need to be clear with attendees about that it's a give and take. I would say, listening sessions where we can provide a platform to help solve people's problems and connect them with resources is a great way to employ a listening session. And that I think if we can create an environment where people can have mutual understanding, sort of walk a mile in another person's shoes through a listening session. And I think in my example that I sent to you, Michael, was the one that we had about the affordable housing experience, where we had people, developers of affordable housing, and then we had people, residents of affordable housing, and we could hear give and take in terms of understanding what some of the challenges are on both sides, and enhance mutual understanding and on both sides. So I think that's was valuable, and we have to be careful that we are not inviting attendees that are there to promote their activist agenda or to use it as a platform to air grievances. That's not what those are for. They're for listening and sharing a broad range of views. That's my opinion on them. So I think if we can offer listening sessions in person, where I think they are much better in person than online, that are structured in that way, that is the way in which I would want to approach listening sessions.
So using that model, I just reread what you wrote. A listening session would be more like practitioners sharing their knowledge, much in the way we're hearing from city officials in some of our meetings, but perhaps a little bit more open, larger format. And I think, getting people like Scott Holton as a ULI member is a great idea. Is that kind of what you have in mind with that? Maybe a little bit more by invitation only, and get the experts to tell us how they can get these things done?
Not necessarily by invitation only. I think it's being able to represent two sides of an issue. For example, in the affordable housing panel or listening session that we had people who are residents of affordable housing and people that develop affordable housing. And for residents to hear that Scott took out a $20 million, personally guaranteed a $20 million loan to build an affordable housing development, I think was helpful, because they understood that all this, he had to put his own home on the line, personally guarantee something to get that he believed in getting something done. Yes, he runs a for-profit business, but yes, he also put his livelihood at risk And then for him to hear some of the challenges that people have living in an affordable unit that requires some maintenance after a certain period of time and not having access to funds to replace the flooring or whatever it is, and how do we solve for that? So I think a shared mutual understanding and a sharing of information and perspective. And people were great. They didn't air their grievances. They shared their experiences, and it was just helpful to have all of that. And it just creates more shared appreciation for others in the community and less polarization. I think that's a worthy goal these days.
That's great. Bringing two threads together, is it worth discussing a listening session on missing middle that would include community members, housing developers, people who finance housing?
I think that's a great idea. And in commuters, why do people leave?
Yeah, I mean, I think, just going to jump in real quick on the listening sessions. I kind of have a bit of a soft spot, and I do believe that it is I think it's an important part of our role, but I agree with Juliet that the focus on them and the structure of them, and maybe even the selection of them, needs to be a little bit more focused in. And I think that one that we did around tiny homes and people's experiences with that was great. And the affordable housing, because it did bring those sides together just to hear perspective. And I'd love to see that kind of thing continue. I think it's an interesting what you just brought up, Michael, because part of me was, when I was listening to Juliet, I was like, well, should listening sessions, should we specifically focus those around work that council is doing? Because in one sense that, and I'm just rolling this around in my head, in one sense, that then really gives council, as Juliet was concerned about before, we're not kind of spreading the net, but we're helping council to get some feedback from the public. And that could be a very helpful addition to their data set, so to speak. On the other hand, there's kind of this educational piece that leads me down the road that you just suggest, Michael, which is like, well, the missing middle, we know it's something that's of interest in town, and councils try to engage with it in certain ways. And so should we go out and kind of see what the community understands about that and what their perspectives are on it? So I guess there's kind of two different ways that we could utilize the listening session. And I'm wondering if we should be open to both of those, or if it's better to focus on one that may keep our tracks a little closer together, so to speak, and keep us from bringing in, I guess some can be useful for us, some might be useful for council. And I guess I'm just wondering about that and how we use them in that way. So.
Go ahead, Danny.
Well, I think, we've had so few, particularly given the form that we've been moving forward on here for well over a year now. So I think, the whole notion right now of focusing on the things that really touch on key council initiatives makes a lot of sense, and we can fill our plate with those without question. The other thing is, I think I take the tiny homes presentation, which to me was the most effective one that we had, and I didn't see as much of advocacy as I saw an educational approach to begin the thing. And so I think we definitely don't want to have, and there's no way there's really no way to address, both sides or talking on a certain issue, because there's always going to be a multitude of sides. And so I think the whole notion is we try to provide some information or insight, either from people in that industry, tiny homes again being an example, or groups that are focused on that. We had the individual that worked on the actual tiny homes project in Longmont, and then from there, we are specifically opening it up to the public. It's kind of like the sausage factory. It might not be pretty, but it's comes up with a good end result. But we're opening it up to the public to really explore what the insights are that are there. And at its best, it could be very informative for us, very useful for council to say, listen, people came, they attended, they had some real insight to hear that you might not just get when you're just hearing individuals speak that are either from advocacy groups or from industry groups, what have you. And so I really think just focusing right now, we could fill our plate for the next 6 months easily, focusing on the ones that are reflective of what town council's also concentrating on, and not having any advocacy groups, but having more of an informative presentation, and then having a forum for the public to interact with this board to try to get as much information or insight as we can, and the reporting on that to council. I think that's our most effective means going forward, without question.
Really interesting idea of providing a forum for rational discussion. We've done that a few times and had workshops with registered neighborhood organizations in Denver. And, you bring in a panel of developers and people are shocked to find out, extreme example would be Scott Holton, what people put on the line, what the developers put on the line to try to make something happen. And then the developers are, not completely shocked, but surprised at, what they could have done differently to avoid acrimony simply by listening to neighbors more. So I actually think that can be very productive because, the conversation in the 3-minute sound bites at planning board and council is very much us versus them, and ultimately not productive. Just one side feels like they win, the other side feels like they lose. So I would certainly endorse that direction. And I don't know, do we want to take a look at council priorities and think about 3 things we could focus on? We already got one, I think. Missing middle / home ownership opportunities in Boulder that don't currently exist.
I'd say right.
You say what? Are you muted now, Danny? You're still muted.
Oh, how about now?
Yeah, that's great.
Okay, sorry. I'd say right now we have the middle income one. We don't have Terry here, unfortunately. We have a few board members that we don't know yet, and so let's focus on that middle income one, and we might be able to do it. And I think what we had talked about before was trying to have it live, because I just don't see. I've probably done 50 public meetings for planning commissions and stuff like that with work that are Zoom, and they're just nowhere nearly as effective as a public forum. So I think what we talked about is whenever we're live again, then we'll plan to have a listening session on middle income, and maybe take it from there. And when we have some more folks in us, little happy few right now, then we can kind of plan for the next steps. But I think that's probably the best approach.
Mm-hmm. Great. I think we're maybe less certain about the in-person than we were 2 weeks ago, but I don't mind planning and hoping for the best. What could we do in between now or at our next meeting to move this idea forward?
Well, I guess I'm wondering if we're leaning towards saying, okay, let's have or I just want to see if I'm clear. Are we leaning towards saying if we do a listening session, we will focus on the middle income housing? Is that kind of where we're landing with everybody?
That sounds good to me. I think that makes a lot of sense. I like the idea of alignment. Our listening session aligning with this problem that we're trying to tackle is in the
Okay.
city.
Yeah. I mean, I think I'd be in favor of that also. I like the idea of it. I guess the next step I would suggest is, if we're going to be looking at that, what exactly are we trying to, accomplish around the middle income piece in a listening session? Would be the question. Maybe, I don't know, Michael, maybe we can each just give our input after the meeting and prior to the next one, so that we can take a look at that and kind of start to narrow it down and give it some structure.
Well, maybe we need to hear the presentation about the middle income first, and then see what would make most sense for a structure without knowing all that Jay is going to talk about. And I have to miss the next one, but I will watch the recording.
Yeah, that's not a bad
Sorry.
idea.
I'm sorry, who would make that? You're talking about a presentation just for our board.
Well, Jay's going to talk about that at the next meeting. That's
Right,
the
right.
agenda for the next meeting. Do you have any comments, Jay?
Yeah.
I forget.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's a great approach. I was going to say exactly what Jacques did. Just, start writing down, what do you think the purpose should be? Who's the audience? What do you hope to accomplish? And the earliest that in the past, the earliest we've done that and the clearest we've been in that written description, the more successful those listening sessions have been. So I think it's everything you guys have been talking about. And we can add something to the agenda, Michael, for August afterwards, to have sort of an agenda item that talks about planning a potential listening session around middle income and missing middle.
I'd like to do that planning with everybody on board and not, shuffle out to a subcommittee. We have good minds here, and I think we could reach some conclusions about an agenda and how it might work pretty quickly.
Mhm.
So, sorry, I already forgot that you were saying, Jay. No offense.
Oh, no.
And I'm wondering if Lupita has any comments, because from the planning board perspective, in terms of what they have coming up on their plan and how, and maybe I don't want to put you on the spot, Lupita, but you might have some ideas about what you think would be useful for us to think about the ways in which we might structure this or do other things as it relates to what you have going on your board.
Well, thank you for giving me that chance to speak. Actually, I was listening and agreeing with you guys all along. The only thing that I wanted to add to what Jacques mentioned was that I like to think of listening sessions also opportunities to build community because of basically bringing the groups that are often in seeming conflict, that if we were to approach this is a very important problem that we have identified, and we are coming together and we want to hear from you what ideas you might have. I think the missing middle came up as an important problem for the planning board. That was one of the topics or things that we included on our annual letter to city council. So, but we haven't been able to do a whole lot. And some of the questions I asked was because of that, just kind of gathering more information and recognizing, really, is this something that we think is a real problem, or is the city agreeing with us? And does anybody have other possible ideas that can help us move forward and making progress on solving this one problem? And the format, I think that, getting the background, just like we got today, and I know I was in the room when we did the affordable housing talk, but I was in Puerto Rico. I was so exhausted that day. I knew the topic so important to me, and I can, for the life of me, remember very little of it. So I was so lucky that I was able to listen this time with a better mind. It's because these are complex topics. So I think the missing middle is something that it will pay off for us to understand more from the perspective of what the city is doing, and then get together with the community to see, where they're coming from and bringing these different subsections together, I think.
Lupita, can I ask you, as you said, you and Planning Board haven't had a chance to do much specifically around that, but have you had, some discussions about it and avenues that you think are, potential solutions or ways to improve our missing middle condition? Is there any kind of discussion on Planning Board or consensus or areas of attack, so to speak, for the problem?
Nothing that is, like well-defined yet. We started with, even getting more background information for our retreat. We were gonna specifically learn more about it. We got a book and we had some initial discussions, and some of that even came up like today, where what is the data the most reliable data that we have about this problem? And it after Juliet mentioned, I said, oh yes, Sarah brought it up too, because this is like the one source of data we have regarding our commuters. But what we have been able to do with it, nothing really, as far as I can tell. But at least that topic is coming up, and that to me is promising, because more people are becoming more aware of it and they want to do something. So to me, it's a putting together, our heads together and including the community to look forward. That was why one of my questions had to do with, is there anything that coming down the pipeline that we hadn't considered from before in terms of potential sources of funding that can help us do something about this particular sector that right now we don't seem to have, funds to really do much with. So that's sort of like what I'm going, to propose. I think this is a good place, and just keep at it.
Jay, will you be covering the down payment assistance program on your presentation?
So yeah, I'll talk about changes that we made to our current program. I can talk about the ballot measure if you like, but that's kind of a separate issue.
Well, just, I know it's just getting started with implementation, right? Or that's all getting not
It's
yet.
all on hold. The piece is on hold, but there are quite a few other things that we're doing to address middle income ownership. And I'll cover those. So what's outlined in the strategy, what we've accomplished so far, what we're working on now, and what we hope to tackle in the future. So we'll talk about all that.
Great. I think we've done an excellent job of focusing on a particular issue and particular ways of addressing it. If you don't mind, if we could keep moving through the agenda. If no one objects, we will go on to item C under number 5, committee and project liaison reports. We have 2 folks who worked on the tiny homes report, and I don't know if there are any updates, but Jacques and Danny, if you have anything to add on that, please do so. You feel like we covered that at the previous meeting?
All right. All right. It keeps, for some reason, shutting me off. Okay. I think that I kind of wanted to review a little bit what we were talking about with the ADU discussion to begin with. And then what I've really funneled down to is the piece that I've been looking at. And I have a sketch of what I think a proposed change in our city regs would look like. And I've effectively modeled this after other cities who've done similar things, with variations, of course, because some are fairly specific, like Lyons, but Albuquerque, Fresno, LA. So the mobile ADU piece is fairly widespread, or it's getting much more widespread, I should say. And we're seeing it adopted in quite a few spots. I think, you know, I have expressed before my rationale for thinking that this is something that we should try to do. It's a relatively small lift, as I see it, from the kind of code related changes that would be needed. There are, you know, in all of these other jurisdictions where this has been implemented, it's a pretty parallel structure as far as what needs to be dealt with within the code. And the first and the biggest piece, and this is the linchpin of it all really, is that what occurs is that mobile ADUs are made a subcategory or an acceptable category with ADUs. So essentially that's the piece that really impacts this. Outside of that, the building requirements and health and safety requirements are really all already engaged with in existing code, either through the manufactured housing ANSI standards or through Appendix Q of the IRC, which Appendix Q deals with tiny homes in general. Now our, you know, and just to put that in perspective, the reason this is an issue is because our code specifically requires foundations. So that's the one piece that was problematic, but if you bring in the manufactured housing, that foundation piece is also engaged with, and there are foundation and pad requirements. So basically I've put together this proposal, and I can read it off to you. I'd like to just read it off to everybody briefly. It's essentially 12 points that would be the backbone of this change that would allow mobile ADUs. The first one is just that we change the BRC so that the mobile ADU is an acceptable and it falls under the umbrella of ADUs. Second piece, zoning related, it basically, or the next couple are zoning related. It's allowable in the same districts as ADUs. So again, it's just falling under our ADU policy. It has to meet the same zoning regulations as far as height, setback, coverage on a lot, FAR. I personally would propose a special allowance for front yard, but I'm sure that that's something that would be discussed at length further and may not be viable, but I would suggest it. And when sited in a front or side yard setback, this is number 4, that the undercarriage, the wheels, the axles, the tongue and hitch should all be hidden from view. That's a pretty standard piece in the tiny home, the mobile tiny home regs in other jurisdictions. I'm not clear why that should be a part of a regulatory structure if this tiny home is not visible from a public street. So if it's in a rear yard, I don't see why that would be a requirement. I understand it fully for a front yard and a side yard where it might be visible from the street. So anyway, those are, again, more detailed pieces. Number 5 is kind of, this hits the regulatory issues with both pad requirements, tie down or foundation requirements, or what I call foundation, and they're non-permanent foundations. And that is that any MADU or mobile ADU should meet or must meet the ANSI NFPA, the fire protection, and the NEC standards, the electric code standards. And again, those are common to all the regulatory structures. Number 6 is we also have to meet the Appendix Q IRC standards. Number 7, it must be connected to city water, wastewater, and electric systems. Number 8 has to do with occupancy. This is another one that I kind of throw out there. I pulled down what these other standards have put in place. I think it's one that is worthy of discussion, which has to do with the occupancy limits, and they go to 4 people, so that no more than 4 persons may occupy mobile ADU. Another one to be discussed is the square footage allowance. Most of these break the square footage maximum at about 440. I'm not sure that that's, I'm not sure where I land on that one. I've left that in here in my proposal that we stick with a 400 square foot. But I think it's worth having discussion about, if we're going to move forward with this further, about what that square footage allowance would be, both minimum and maximum. Then MADUs must be sited on concrete or structurally competent pads and anchored to meet local wind load requirements and ANSI standards. Again, that's covered within our rules and regs, but I think it's just one that people immediately come up with as a concern. So it's worth noting in there that that's going to be, those requirements are going to be met. This is one that I've added in. I've had some discussions with David Lowry, our fire marshal, about this, which is that MADUs will not be required to be fire sprinkled. And I'm sure there will be, because ADUs are currently required to have fire sprinklers. I think it's ridiculous to require, well, in certain cases, I actually think it's ridiculous to require ADUs less than 800 square feet to be fire sprinkled when we look at what the rationale is for fire sprinkling a home. And it basically has to do with time of egress and firefighting access. And when you're talking about a 400 or 500 square foot space, the egress is very close and the access for firefighting is also very rapid. So I think it doesn't really make a lot of logical sense, but we have adopted it. And so I would exclude mobile ADUs depending on where we ended up with square footage, or mobile ADUs beneath a certain square footage from that sprinkler requirement. However, they would be required to have, of course, smoke and CO detectors, which is standard code requirements, and also a working fire extinguisher within the unit. That's one that a number of other jurisdictions have pulled in when they've eliminated the fire sprinkler requirement. And then the other one, which I think makes a lot of sense, and I discussed this with David, was probably more critical, and it's not within the code necessarily already, is to require an egress within the sleeping compartment of the ADU, because I think that's the greatest risk from a fire perspective. So those are all aligned, those last ones are all aligned with kind of the fire access and egress concerns around ADUs. But basically, if we make an ADU, a mobile ADU, and bring it under the umbrella of ADUs from a zoning perspective, the regulatory requirements between the manufactured housing rules and our codes already cover all of these other pieces, including utilities access and everything else. So in some ways, it's not a terribly heavy lift. From a regulatory standpoint, it's, and I would like to, what I propose doing now with this is essentially giving this outline to the board, and I will just, after this meeting, if everybody wants, if we agree that you want to see this, I will present this outline, and I'll present it in a PDF format, and I've attached to that PDF format also kind of the supporting documentation from other jurisdictions, from the state of Colorado, and the mobile or the manufactured housing requirements from the state of Colorado, which also touch on some of these points, so are salient to it, and kind of present that in a package for you guys to look at prior to our next meeting, or maybe the next one after, depending when the agenda would allow us to look at that and see if we want to proceed any further down the road with the mobile ADU piece. So that's kind of where I'm sitting with the ADUs. I also have a list of kind of what are the main code related concerns, just so that people can be thinking about those as you're reading these pieces. And I'll just finish by saying that's kind of the mobile part, which I personally would like to see us kind of take up and make a recommendation to council at some point, that this might be something that they could engage with relatively easily, and it would provide, I think, some significant benefits to homeowners who do not have the financial capability themselves to put in an ADU. I'm doing an 800 square foot ADU right now. I mean, I'm doing it basically pro bono from my perspective as a builder, and doing the permitting process and the architectural design. And it's still going to cost my clients almost $200,000 to build this in their yard, which for most people is prohibitive. And the mobile ADU allowance would let somebody put in a pad, which may cost no more than $20,000 to $30,000, and then bring in a unit, place it on that, which could be owned by someone other than themselves, and they could lease the pad out. So it really can open up the financial access point, I think, for ADUs. So that's why I'd like to present it. Other pieces that we looked at under ADU stuff, I'll break off onto that now, is we were looking at, and I just have a list of them here, kind of, and this may still apply to the ADU thing. And Jay, I know that there's an ADU update review coming up at some point in the future. We don't know when that's going to actually realize itself. But things that we've talked about are fee relief for people who are trying to get ADUs in place. And one of the reasons I bring that one up is things that we still, I think, are worthy looking at, probably when we get to what you're doing, Jay, and this mobile ADU may also be beyond that, is because the fee relief piece, we've seen in other jurisdictions that is the break. Making it financially accessible to people is where you really start to see an uptick in the adoption of ADUs. And so under those things, we're looking at fee waivers, standard pre-approved plans, which are utilized in other jurisdictions. I don't know why we can't utilize them here in the city of Boulder, which will greatly decrease people's costs and somehow streamlining the permit process. So those are all of the parts to that. I'll send this out to everybody after the meeting if you want to see it, and we could think about looking at it down the road.
Yep, Danny, please do send it out. Jacques and Danny, go ahead.
Jacques, I'd love to see it. I'm a development code nerd. I have drafted tons of it myself too. So, that attention to detail and all the different aspects that we'd be wrestling with here is phenomenal. But I think this is really going back to the retreat and everything. This is kind of the meaty, substantive stuff that we talked about that, we want to try to do that's really along the lines of implementation. So I think it's great. I'm excited to look it over and, be happy to love to chat with you about it. And if there's any other thoughts or anything on it, but I think it's a huge first step. And I love to see that be something that we can, work on putting together to throw out to council and say, hey, here's something we can do. Here's how we do it. This is why it's important. And going back to what we talked about before, this ties directly to a listening session we had that was actually very productive and substantive. And I think from that listening session, that's where we got the insight or the revelation even that mobile tiny homes and mobile ADUs is really a highly preferable in a lot of circumstances. And so to see this coming through to fruition, I think is awesome. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, I'll look forward to getting your fine tooth comb into the regulatory piece, because I see it from the builder perspective. You probably see it from the legal perspective, and it'd be good to marry those two.
Well, I like the way it dovetails with our previous conversation about missing middle, because ADUs can help, people attain or maintain home ownership, obviously. I would add, and I can't wait to review what you've done, but I would add that when we present to council, it'd be interesting to present, what are the experiences of these other communities that have adopted such strategies and ordinances. Has it increased the housing supply for ADUs, and has it benefited the homeowners who are providing the pad and the hookup? I also had a small technical question. Is the sprinkler requirement new? Because we did our ADU in 2017 and we did not have to put in a
Yes,
sprinkler, just
it's new.
alarms. Oh, interesting. Wow.
Yeah. It came in.
Any have anything to add on this subject? Okay.
History?
Well, I just say, I've seen sprinkler requirements for large homes and a lot of codes, but at that size, you could reach anywhere with a fire extinguisher. So I think the sprinkler thing's a good thing to try to avoid. So
Well, my ADU has 5 windows, and the tenants
Right.
jump out of one of them,
exactly.
and they're on the ground right away. But
Well, we can talk about it more later, but I mean, the main idea behind it is that these are detached structures, often above a garage, accessed by an alley. And it's just, I think the argument is that it's difficult to get a fire truck back there or a hose.
Right.
So that's why the extra level of precaution. But
I see.
there are other systems, and we can talk about those later too.
Great. Juliet, would you like to talk about EPRAs?
Yeah, EPRIS. So just to quickly let everyone know that the NEWR's ordinance that was passed has been adopted and is now referred to as EPRIS, it's rental assistance and
Eviction prevention.
eviction prevention and rental assistance program. Sorry.
I'm
That's,
glad I'm not the
anyway, it's a new acronym now. It moved from NEWR's to EPRIS. So I spent, I just wanted to let you guys know that I spent about 10 hours over a couple weeks of time helping Jay Allen and Karen Armstrong and Clay Fong interview a pool of candidates who were interested in being in a tenant advisory committee to make sure that this program gets implemented as it was intended. They're all renters. It's a committee of 5. They'll meet quarterly. They're paid a very small stipend, but they're paid to participate. And I just assisted in the selection process or the interview process, both the initial round and then a final round of interviews. And I felt useful because I interviewed people for a living. So I felt I could put my skills to some good volunteer use in that capacity. And it was fun, productive. I hope Jay Allen and Clay and Karen thought so too.
They were extremely appreciative. Thank you so much, Juliet. And I apologize, it was 10 hours when I promised you it was closer to 3.
Uh-oh.
That's all right. It wasn't all in one day. It was spread out, and I was happy to help.
Well, thank you. That's kind of its own listening session for you, right? So is that chapter closed for you now? The people have been selected. The committee is doing its work, starting to do its work?
Well, yeah, they've been selected, and their first meeting, I'm not sure if that's been set yet. They talked about having it set sometime in September, October, or August or September, but there's still a lot of, it's such a new program. It's not fully baked, and there's not even the first meeting is going to be about what exactly does this board do every time it meets and how. So I was able to share the perspective of being on a volunteer committee like this one, and what works well and what works less well in terms of being effective. So from my own perspective. Yeah.
We're
Great.
still working working on that
That's
discussion.
been action. Thank you again.
Sure, I was happy to contribute.
I'm sure we'll be monitoring that program as it continues to evolve. Anything else on that, or can we go on to the next agenda item?
That's all I got.
Great. Jay, any matters from staff we need to review?
I just have 4 quick updates for you. So one has to do with the recruitment, the midterm recruitment the council is going to do to fill the 2 slots. So Michael mentioned that. I sent the email, I think it was yesterday, to everybody. Please share that with your networks. It'd be great to get some good candidates. So it's kind of up to us to make sure that that good people apply. So that's one. Number 2, community benefit for that project. So I don't know if you were following city council, but currently the community benefit applied specifically to affordable housing. Phase 2 was supposed to apply to nonprofits, as well as human services, as well as affordable commercial. And basically went through planning board, went to first hearing at council, and council decided not to pass the second reading, and to basically go back to affordable housing being the primary community benefit. The good news is the extent or the range of where it applies, we were talking about earlier, Juliet, the map will set to expire. So fortunately, a broader, or basically the entire city will be, or almost the entire city will be eligible for the community benefit provision. So we'll be actually able to see how effective it is as a tool. Third, as Juliet was talking about, the rental assistance is still ramping up. That committee, they will meet, I think their first meeting is going to be in late September, early October. But the moratorium expires this weekend. So it's going to be kind of a real test to see, you know, is there going to be a tsunami or a cliff, or, you know, a surge in evictions? We don't really know yet, but I would say that there's a lot of preparation that's gone into making sure that we have the staff at the county as well as the city to help distribute the funds. And we have quite a bit in reserve to help provide those resources. So we're trying to get the word out, but I wanted you to be aware of it as well. These are resources to tenants as well as to landlords. And the last piece has to do with in-person meetings. So I don't know if you've been following the council discussion. They were contemplating going back for a test run in August. They have decided to postpone that to early October. I think there were concerns about the Delta variant. So the same direction pretty much stands. We're going to follow their lead. So once council goes back in person, that'll be our cue to be able to go back into person. And there might be some options for hybrid, but all of that is still being discussed. So I just want to let you know that the conversation is still happening, but no decisions have been made. Any questions about any of that? All good? Everybody tired?
Agreed. Thank you, Jay.
So, yeah.
I think you just said thanks.
Oh, sorry.
We're
so
all
yeah,
so zoomed out that it's hard to pay attention.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I have a quick non-Zoom suggestion. And I don't know if it breaks the rules or not, but we have a Boulder committee in my organization, and we're going to do our next meeting in person at Diagonal Plaza and just kind of walk through and talk about what's proposed there. Be a learning opportunity. If that's not considered a meeting and a violation of sunshine laws, I would love to, invite everybody to come along just to learn. I imagine we'll have a city official, a developer, and maybe someone else talking about, what's being discussed there. Danny, you're muted. Still muted. you go.
Oh, could you hear me now?
Yeah,
Oh yeah, that's not a meeting. You're right. So we can pull that off. So I'd love to know what it is. I'd love to see that.
okay. I'll just, I'll send an invite through Corey. Again, it won't be us meeting. We'll just be listening. We'll be in the same place. We'll be listening. You know, it's not to discuss any particular policy, just to learn about what's happening there and learn more about the site. Okay, great. Anything else from Jay or others on the call?
Just add, so keep in mind next month, August meeting will be the middle income piece, but also presenting on the form-based code for Alpine Balsam,
Oh, great.
as well as the comprehensive rezonings. And that will go to planning board September 2nd and then council October 5th. So that'll be, it's up to you guys whether or not you want to make a formal recommendation, but that'll be entirely up to you. Just wanted to give you a preview.
Okay, and that's the last Thursday in August, correct?
Wednesday, yep.
Wednesday, I'm sorry. Yeah, I am tired.
I unfortunately have to miss the next one. So, but I will watch the recording.
Okay, do we need a motion to adjourn? We got a motion, anyone second? All in favor? Maybe we'll see you, I think that is I believe that's gonna be August 11th. I'll send the invite out when I get back from, I'm taking a trip tomorrow, but early next week. And thank you all, very thoughtful discussion, and we'll be seeing you soon.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Michael.
Thanks, Corey. Thanks, Jay. Thanks, Lupita. Thanks, Michael.
Thank you, everybody.
Good night.
Thanks,
Bye, all.
everyone. Have a great night.